The dining room fell silent, except for the ticking of Mom's antique clock. Rachel's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Nobody wanted to acknowledge. Pathetic, she'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice dripping with the kind of cruelty that only family members can perfect. The mashed potatoes were getting cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Uncle Jim shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and me, I just not the fake smile I'd worn for years at these gatherings, but something different. Something that made Rachel's confident smirk falter just slightly. She had no idea that her boss would be getting a very interesting phone call from the governor's office in exactly 72 hours. She had no idea that her perfect little world was about to crumble faster than the pumpkin pie she'd been bragging about all evening. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The whole mess started 6 months earlier. Though if I'm being honest, it probably began when we were kids, and Rachel learned she could make me disappear just by being louder. But this particular chapter of our family drama kicked off in May, when I made what everyone called the stupidest career move in Thompson family history. I was working at Morrison & Associates, a mid-tier consulting firm in downtown Denver, where I'd spent 3 years climbing the corporate ladder one Excel spreadsheet at a time. The pay was decent, the benefits were solid, and my parents finally had something respectable to tell their country club friends when asked about their younger daughter. "Katie's in consulting," Mom would say with the kind of pride she reserved for Rachel's government job announcement. It wasn't the passionate enthusiasm she showed when discussing Rachel's latest promotion at the Colorado Department of Environmental Protection, but it was something. Then the Clearwater Industries contract landed on my desk. Clearwater was one of those companies that looked pristine on paper. Clean logo, corporate social responsibility reports, a website filled with images of diverse employees planting trees and smiling at solar panels. They wanted Morrison & Associates to help them navigate some regulatory compliance issues related to a new mining operation in the San Luis Valley. Standard stuff, except for the part where I actually read the environmental impact reports. The reports that showed Clearwater planned to dump millions of gallons of contaminated water into groundwater systems that supplied drinking water to 3 rural communities. The reports that detailed how their mining process would destroy a wetland habitat that had taken decades to restore. The reports that somehow never made it past the preliminary review stage at the state environmental office. I spent 2 weeks digging deeper, staying late at the office, following paper trails that led to shell companies and subsidiary corporations. What I found made my stomach turn. Clearwater wasn't just planning environmental destruction, they were systematically bribing state officials to look the other way, and the money trail led straight to several high-ranking employees at the Colorado Department of Environmental Protection, including my sister Rachel. The Thompson family had always operated on a simple principle: don't rock the boat. Dad built his accounting practice on discretion and reliability. Mom maintained her social standing through careful networking and strategic silence. Rachel advanced her career by being competent, ambitious, and politically savvy. I was supposed to follow the same playbook: keep my head down, collect my paycheck, and maybe get promoted to senior associate in a few years. But I couldn't sleep knowing that thousands of people might lose access to clean drinking water because my consulting firm helped a corrupt company buy off state regulators. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror knowing I'd taken money to facilitate what amounted to legalized poisoning. So I called the FBI. Agent Marcus Webb met me at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday until I opened my mouth and changed everything. He was younger than I expected, with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen enough corporate corruption to fill several lifetimes. I handed him copies of everything I'd found, explaining the connections between Clearwater, the bribes, and the state environmental office. "This is substantial," he said after reviewing the documents for 20 minutes. "You understand what this means for your family?" I understood. Rachel wasn't just implicated, she was the primary contact listed in several bribery schemes. Her signature was on approval documents that had been backdated. Her personal bank account showed deposits that perfectly matched the timeline of Clearwater's permit approvals. "She's my sister," I told Agent Webb. But she's also breaking the law and putting people's lives at risk. 3 days later, I submitted my resignation letter to Morrison and Associates. I didn't explain why, just cited personal reasons, and cleared out my desk while my coworkers speculated about burnout or a nervous breakdown. Dad called it career suicide, Mom called it a complete embarrassment. Rachel called it typical Katie behavior, always making dramatic gestures instead of thinking things through. None of them knew about the FBI investigation. None of them knew I'd spent the last week consulting with a whistleblower attorney who specialized in environmental crime. None of them knew that I'd already lined up freelance grant writing work that would pay the bills while I figured out what came next. They just knew that Katie had quit her respectable job without explanation and was now living off savings while finding herself like some kind of millennial cliché. The family dinner where I broke the news was brutal. We were sitting around the kitchen table at Mom and Dad's house in Lakewood, the same table where Rachel and I had eaten countless meals as kids, where homework had been completed, and college plans discussed and future dreams cautiously shared. Now it felt like a tribunal. "You can't just quit without having another job lined up," Dad said, his accountant's brain unable to process such financial recklessness. "What about your retirement contributions, your health insurance?" "I have a plan," I said, which was technically true if plan meant hope the FBI investigation moves quickly and I can find enough freelance work to survive. Rachel leaned back in her chair with that particular expression she'd perfected in high school, the one that suggested she was watching something mildly entertaining but ultimately insignificant. "Let me guess, you're going to become a yoga instructor, or maybe start a nonprofit to save the whales." "I'm going to focus on grant writing for environmental organizations," I said. "Oh, that's rich." Rachel's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're going to write grants for tree huggers while actual professionals like me do the real work of environmental protection." The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast, but I kept my mouth shut. The FBI had been very clear about maintaining operational security until they were ready to move. Mom sighed in that particular way that suggested I'd personally disappointed 3 generations of Thompson women. "Katie, sweetheart, I know you mean well, but you've always been a little impractical. Maybe this is just a phase you need to work through before you find a real career again." A real career, as opposed to my sister's real career, which involved taking bribes to help corporations poison rural communities. That dinner set the tone for the next 6 months. Every family gathering became an opportunity for concerned intervention. Every phone call included gentle suggestions about job openings Dad had heard about through his clients. Every conversation with Rachel included subtle digs about my extended unemployment and quarter-life crisis. The freelance work was actually going well. I'd connected with several environmental nonprofits and land conservation groups, helping them secure funding for habitat restoration projects and clean water initiatives. The work was meaningful, the pay was decent, and I was building a reputation in Denver's environmental community, but my family saw it as expensive therapy, a way to work through whatever psychological issues had led me to torpedo my consulting career. Rachel, meanwhile, was having the best year of her professional life. She'd been promoted to Senior Environmental Compliance Officer in July, which came with a substantial raise and an office with actual windows. She'd started dating Mark Crawford, a lobbyist for renewable energy companies, who looked like he'd stepped out of a political thriller and drove a Tesla he loved to mention in casual conversation. She'd bought a condo in Cherry Creek with granite countertops and a view of the mountain. Every family dinner became an opportunity for Rachel to share another success story while I fielded questions about when I planned to return to normal work. The contrast was deliberate and pointed. Rachel was thriving in the real world while Katie played activist with other people's money. The FBI investigation, meanwhile, was moving at the speed of federal bureaucracy. Agent Webb checked in periodically to update me on their progress, but mostly I waited. I wrote grants for clean water projects while my sister approved permits for companies that contaminated groundwater. I helped secure funding for habitat restoration while Rachel fast-tracked approvals for mining operations that destroyed ecosystems. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but I held on to the knowledge that justice was coming. Then October arrived, and with it, the family's annual tradition of planning Thanksgiving dinner at Mom and Dad's house. I was thinking we could do something special this year, Mom announced during our monthly family lunch at the Cherry Creek. Rachel's promotion, her new relationship, Katie finally getting back on her feet. The last part was said with the kind of hopeful optimism that suggested she genuinely believed my grant writing work was a stepping stone back to corporate respectability. That sounds lovely, Rachel said, cutting her burger with the precision of someone who'd never met a carb she couldn't control. Mark's family is doing their thing in Aspen, so he'll be able to join us. You'll love him, Katie. He's actually accomplished something with his life. The dig was delivered with a smile that could have powered the restaurant's lighting. I smiled back and said I looked forward to meeting him, which was true for reasons Rachel couldn't possibly understand, because Agent Webb had mentioned that Mark Crawford was also under investigation, not for the same bribery scheme that had ensnared Rachel, but for a separate case involving falsified environmental impact reports for several renewable energy projects. Apparently, even the good guys weren't always good guys when enough money was involved. The irony kept building. Rachel was dating another corrupt environmental professional while lecturing me about making responsible career choices. She was planning to bring him to Thanksgiving dinner to show off her successful life while the FBI built cases against both of them. And I was going to sit there, eating turkey and sweet potatoes, pretending I didn't know that their entire world was about to implode. November crawled by with painful slowness. The FBI investigation entered its final phase, with Agent Webb warning me that arrests would likely happen within the next few weeks. Rachel's social media presence reached new heights of professional humble bragging, with LinkedIn posts about innovative environmental policy and Instagram stories from expensive restaurants where she and Mark celebrated various career milestones. I threw myself into my grant writing work, helping a land trust secure $250,000 for wetland restoration in the exact area that Clearwater Industries wanted to destroy. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Agent Webb called with an update. "We're moving on this next week," he said. "Probably Tuesday or Wednesday. Are you prepared for what this means for your family?" I was sitting in my apartment in Capitol Hill, looking out at the Denver skyline while a pot of soup simmered on the stove. Was I prepared to watch my sister get arrested? Was I prepared for my parents to discover that their golden child was a criminal? Was I prepared for the family dynamics I'd grown up with to explode like a nuclear bomb? "I'm prepared," I told him, which felt both completely true and utterly inadequate. "The charges are substantial," Agent Webb continued. "Federal bribery, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, falsification of government documents. She's looking at significant prison time if convicted." Prison time. My sister, who'd never gotten so much as a speeding ticket, was facing federal prison. The sister who'd graduated summa cum laude from Colorado State University. The sister who'd won the State Environmental Policy Award 2 years running. The sister who still called our parents every Sunday and remembered everyone's birthdays, and sent thoughtful Christmas gifts to our cousins' kids. She was also the sister who'd sold out rural communities for money, the sister who'd helped corporations poison drinking water for profit, the sister who'd built her success on corruption and called me pathetic for choosing integrity over comfort. "I understand," I told Agent Webb. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold, with snow threatening in the clouds that hung over the Front Range like a wool blanket. I drove to my parents' house in Lakewood, listening to NPR and trying to process the surreal nature of what was about to unfold. In 3 days, federal agents would arrest my sister, but today we were going to eat turkey and pretend to be grateful for our blessing. The house smelled like sage and butter when I walked in, carrying the cranberry sauce I'd volunteered to make. Mom was in full hostess mode, wearing her good apron and directing traffic in the kitchen like a benevolent dictator. Dad had claimed his usual spot in the living room, watching football with the kind of focused intensity that suggested the fate of democracy hung on whether the Broncos could convert on third down. Rachel arrived 30 minutes later with Mark in tow, making an entrance that suggested they'd rehearsed the choreography. She wore a burgundy sweater dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, paired with boots that clicked against the hardwood floors with satisfying authority. Mark looked exactly like central casting would order for successful lobbyist: tall, well-groomed, expensive coat, smile that had been professionally white. Everyone, "This is Mark," Rachel announced, her voice carrying that particular pitch that suggested she was performing for an audience larger than just our family. "Mark, these are my parents, David and Carol, and my sister Kate." Mark's handshake was firm without being aggressive, his eye contact steady without being intense. He'd clearly spent time perfecting the art of making good first impressions. "Rachel's told me so much about all of you. Thank you for including me in your family tradition." Mom practically glowed. Here was evidence that Rachel had excellent judgment, that she could attract the kind of man who said the right things and wore the right clothes and probably had a 401k that would make Dad weep with joy. "We're so glad you could join us, Mark. Rachel's been looking forward to this for weeks." The first hour unfolded like every family gathering since the dawn of time. Mom orchestrated the meal preparation while accepting compliments on her organizational skills. Dad explained the finer points of football strategy to anyone within earshot. Rachel and Mark held court in the kitchen, regaling us with stories about their professional successes and social adventures. I helped where I could and tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. In 72 hours, this comfortable domesticity would be obliterated. Rachel would be in federal custody. Mark would probably be joining her, though the timing of his arrest remained unclear. Mom and Dad would be fielding phone calls from reporters and trying to understand how their daughter had become a federal criminal. And I would be the sister who'd caused it all by refusing to stay quiet. "Katie's been doing some interesting work lately," Dad announced during a lull in the conversation, clearly trying to include me in the family success narrative. "Grant writing for environmental groups. Very noble stuff." Rachel's smile sharpened just slightly. "Oh yes, Katie's found her calling, saving the planet one grant application at a time. It's so admirable when people can afford to follow their passions instead of worrying about things like career advancement or financial security." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Mark laughed politely, probably thinking this was typical sibling teasing. Mom and Dad exchanged glances that suggested they were torn between defending me and acknowledging Rachel's point about practical career concerns. I could have let it slide. I could have changed the subject or made a self-deprecating joke or simply ignored the dig and helped Mom carve the turkey. That's what the old Katie would have done. The Katie who prioritized family harmony over personal dignity. But the old Katie hadn't spent 6 months carrying the weight of federal crimes while watching the perpetrator lecture her about responsibility. The old Katie hadn't built a career helping organizations protect the exact communities that Rachel was helping corporations exploit. The old Katie hadn't learned that sometimes staying quiet makes you complicit in the destruction. "Actually," I said, setting down my wine glass with deliberate care, "I've been working on some fascinating projects lately. Just last month I helped a land trust secure funding to protect wetlands in the San Luis Valley. Amazing ecosystem down there, critical habitat for migrating birds, natural water filtration, cultural significance for local community. Really makes you appreciate how important environmental protection is." Rachel's smile froze. Mark's polite interest shifted into something sharper. Mom continued arranging dinner rolls like she hadn't heard anything unusual, but Dad's football commentary stopped mid-sentence. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom said, clearly trying to navigate whatever undercurrent she'd detected. "It sounds very meaningful."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Oh, it is," I continued, my voice warm with genuine enthusiasm, "especially when you consider what could happen if that area wasn't protected. Mining operations, chemical contamination, groundwater pollution, affecting drinking water for thousands of people. Really makes you grateful for conscientious government employees who prioritize public health over corporate profits." The silence that followed was thick enough to slice. Rachel's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Mark was studying his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. Dad had abandoned all pretense of watching football. "Well," Rachel said finally, her voice carrying just a hint of strain, "it's easy to be idealistic when you don't understand the complexities of actual policy implementation. Real environmental protection requires working within existing systems, building relationships with industry stakeholders, finding practical compromises that balance economic and ecological concerns." "Absolutely," I agreed with the kind of earnest sincerity that made Rachel's jaw tighten. It takes real integrity to navigate those complexities without compromising your values. I have so much respect for environmental professionals who maintain their ethical standards, even when it would be financially beneficial to look the other way. Mark cleared his throat. Environmental policy is definitely more complex than most people realize. There are a lot of competing interests to balance. I'm sure there are, I said, meeting his gaze directly. It must be challenging to represent renewable energy companies while ensuring that environmental impact assessments are completely accurate and unbiased. Such an important responsibility. The color drained from Mark's face. Rachel's hand found his arm in what might have looked like casual affection, but felt more like a warning. The room filled with the kind of tension that makes small children hide and adults desperately search for safe conversational territory. Should we start carving the turkey? Mom suggested with false brightness. David, would you do the honors? Dad leaped at the opportunity to escape whatever psychological warfare was unfolding in his kitchen. Absolutely. Katie, would you mind helping your mother with the side dishes? I spent the next 20 minutes moving food from the kitchen to the dining room, arranging serving spoons and pretending not to notice the hushed conversation happening between Rachel and Mark in the corner. Their body language suggested an urgent strategy session, the kind of rapid consultation that happens when people realize their carefully constructed facades are developing cracks. When we finally gathered around the dining room table, the atmosphere felt like a diplomatic dinner between hostile nations. Mom had outdone herself with the presentation. Turkey golden brown and perfectly carved mashed potatoes, whipped to impressive peaks, green bean casserole topped with crispy onions, cranberry sauce molded into festive ridges. The good china reflected the chandelier light like tiny mirrors, and autumn-themed placemats added seasonal warmth to the formal dining room. Dad said grace with unusual brevity, perhaps sensing that divine intervention might be necessary to get through the meal without bloodshed. We began eating with the kind of careful politeness that suggested everyone was walking through a minefield while pretending to enjoy a stroll in the park. This cranberry sauce is exceptional, Katie, Mark said, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward safe territory. Did you make it yourself? Thank you. It's actually a recipe I got from a farmer's market vendor in Alamosa, I replied. I was down there doing research for a grant application, and I got to talking with local producers about how mining operations could affect agricultural water rights. Fascinating stuff, really, the interconnection between environmental protection and agricultural sustainability. Rachel's fork clinked against her plate. Katie, perhaps we could talk about something other than your work for once. Some of us are trying to enjoy our meal. Of course, I said with a smile that felt dangerous even to me. What would you like to discuss? Your recent promotion, perhaps. You must be so proud of the work you're doing at the environmental office. I am proud, Rachel said, her voice gaining strength. Unlike some people, I've built a career on actual accomplishments, rather than feel-good activism that accomplishes nothing. The gauntlet had been thrown. Mom and Dad exchanged glances that suggested they were watching their daughters approach a cliff at high speed with no apparent intention of applying the brakes. Mark stared at his mashed potatoes like they might provide guidance for escaping family drama. I think both of my daughters have found meaningful work, Mom said carefully. Rachel's government service and Katie's nonprofit work are both valuable in their own ways. Valuable? Rachel's laugh was sharp enough to cut Chris. Mom, Katie quit a real job to write grant applications for organizations that accomplish nothing except making wealthy liberals feel better about their carbon footprint. She's 32 years old and living like a college student because she's too idealistic to understand how the world actually works. The room went completely silent. Even Dad's usual nervous eating sounds stopped. The antique clock on the mantel ticked loudly enough to serve as a metronome for the tension building around the table. I looked at my sister. Really looked at her for what felt like the first time in months. She was beautiful, successful, confident, and absolutely convinced of her own righteousness. She genuinely believed that her version of environmental protection, the version that involved taking money from corporations in exchange for regulatory approval, was more realistic and effective than my version, which involved helping organizations protect ecosystems from exactly those corporations. She had no idea that federal agents were preparing arrest warrants with her name on them. She had no idea that her bank records had been subpoenaed, and her emails had been reviewed, and her carefully constructed career was about to collapse, like a house of cards in a windstorm. She thought she'd won this argument before it started, that her professional success and financial security and relationship with Mark gave her the moral authority to lecture me about responsibility and maturity. And in that moment, watching her confidence shine like armor she believed was impenetrable, I felt something I hadn't experienced in our 32 years of siblinghood. I felt sorry for her. "You know what, Rachel?" I said quietly, setting down my fork and meeting her gaze direct. "You're absolutely right." The sudden agreement caught her off guard. Her triumphant expression flickered with confusion. "I am pathetic," I continued, my voice steady and calm. "I'm pathetic enough to believe that environmental protection should actually protect the environment. I'm pathetic enough to think that government employees should serve the public interest rather than their own bank accounts. I'm pathetic enough to believe that integrity matters more than financial success." Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. Mark had gone very still beside her. Mom and Dad looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. "I'm so pathetic," I said, my smile growing wider and more genuine with each word, "that I actually reported environmental crimes to the FBI instead of participating in them." The silence that followed was absolute. No ticking clock, no distant football commentary, no sounds from the kitchen. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Rachel's face went through several colors before settling on a shade of pale that matched the fine china. Mark's hand, which had been reaching for his wineglass, froze halfway to the table. Dad's mouth hung open like he was trying to speak but had forgotten how language worked. "What?" Rachel whispered. "Did you just—" I picked up my wineglass and took a careful sip, savoring both the burgundy and the moment. "I said I reported environmental crimes to the FBI, about 6 months ago actually. Right around the time I quit Morrison & Associates after discovering that Clearwater Industries was bribing state environmental officials to approve permits for projects that would contaminate groundwater and destroy protected habitat." The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been building for months, and finally found enough oxygen to ignite. Rachel's carefully constructed world began to crumble in real time, her face reflecting the dawning understanding that her little sister hadn't been having a quarter-life crisis after all. She'd been building a case that would destroy everything Rachel had worked for, and she'd been doing it with the kind of patient precision that only someone who truly understood the stakes could manage. "Katie," Mom said faintly, "what are you talking about?" I looked around the table at my family, these people who'd shaped me and challenged me and ultimately taught me that sometimes love means telling the truth even when it destroys everything you thought you knew. "I'm talking about the fact that Rachel has been taking bribes to approve environmental permits for companies that are poisoning rural communities," I said simply. "And I'm talking about the fact that the FBI will probably be arresting her sometime next week." And then I smiled, the smile that had been building for 6 months. The smile that carried the weight of every choice I'd made to protect strangers' drinking water instead of my sister's career. The smile that meant I'd finally learned the difference between family loyalty and moral cowardice. It was the smile that changed everything. Because in 72 hours, Governor Patricia Hayes would indeed be calling Rachel's boss, but not for the reasons anyone at that table could possibly imagine. The wineglass slipped from Rachel's hand, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of burgundy and crystal. The sound broke the spell that had held the dining room frozen, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Mom jumped up to get towels, Dad pushed back from the table so hard his chair nearly toppled, and Mark stared at me like I'd just announced I was an alien from another planet. Rachel remained perfectly still, her face cycling through expressions like a broken slide: shock, denial, rage, terror, and back to shock again. When she finally spoke, her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "You're lying." I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card that I'd been carrying for 6 months, waiting for this exact moment. Agent Marcus Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Environmental Crimes Unit. I placed it gently on the table next to the turkey platter. "His direct number is on the back," I said, conversationally, Feel free to call and ask about case file. I'm sure he'd be happy to discuss the evidence we've compiled. The word we hit Rachel like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed silently while Mark grabbed the business card and studied it like it might suddenly reveal itself to be fake. Mom returned from the kitchen with a handful of dish towels, took one look at the tableau around the dining table, and slowly set them down without cleaning up the wine. Katie Marie Thompson, Dad said, his voice carrying the kind of authority he'd perfected during my teenage years. You need to explain what's happening here, right now. So I did. I told them about the Clearwater Industries files that had crossed my desk at Morrison & Associates. I explained how I'd followed the money trail from shell companies to subsidiary corporations, to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands. I described the systematic bribery scheme that had been operating for 3 years, funneling millions of dollars to state environmental officials in exchange for permit approvals that violated every federal water protection law on the book. I told them about the night I'd sat in my apartment, reading environmental impact reports that detailed exactly how Clearwater's mining operation would destroy the San Luis Valley wetlands, how the chemical runoff would contaminate aquifers that supplied drinking water to Alamosa, Monte Vista, and Del Norte, how children in rural communities would develop cancer clusters in 10 years if someone didn't stop this company from turning their backyard into a toxic waste dump. I told them about calling the FBI the next morning. You've been working with federal agents for 6 months, Mom asked faintly, sinking into her chair like she'd forgotten how to stand. Our Katie, I confirmed, the same Katie who's apparently too idealistic to understand how the world works. Rachel finally found her voice, and when she spoke it was with the fury of someone watching their entire life implode in real time. You destroyed our family for a bunch of strangers. You betrayed your own sister for people you've never even met. I protected people from being poisoned, I replied calmly, including you actually. The FBI was going to uncover this corruption eventually. By cooperating early, I probably saved you from additional charges. Additional charge? Mark spoke for the first time since I'd dropped the bomb, his voice barely above a whisper. What charges are we talking about here? I looked at him with something approaching sympathy. Well, for Rachel, we're looking at federal bribery, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, falsification of government documents, and violation of the Clean Water Act. The FBI estimates she took approximately $400,000 in bribes over 3 years. Rachel made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. 400,000. Katie, that's not, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted gently. You thought you were just expediting permits for legitimate businesses. You thought everyone was doing it. You thought the environmental impact was minimal and the economic benefits outweighed the risks. You thought a little flexibility in regulatory enforcement was just part of the job. Her face told me I'd hit every rationalization exactly right. This was the story she'd been telling herself for 3 years. The narrative that let her sleep at night while she helped corporations poison rural communities for profit. And Mark, I continued, turning to face my sister's boyfriend with the same gentle sympathy, the FBI is also very interested in your work with Renewable Horizons. Apparently falsifying environmental impact reports for wind farm projects is still fraud, even when you're working for the good guys. Mark went so pale I thought he might faint into his mashed potatoes. How could you possibly know about Agent Webb is very thorough, I said. Financial records, email communications, travel receipts that show you and Rachel taking trips to the Cayman Islands at the same time that large deposits appeared in both your accounts. It's almost like you were laundering money together. The silence that followed was broken only by Dad's labored breathing. He was staring at Rachel like he'd never seen her before, his face gray with shock and something that looked like pumpkin, he said finally, using the nickname he'd called Rachel since she was 5 years old. Tell me this isn't true. Rachel's composure finally cracked completely. Tears started streaming down her face, smearing her carefully applied makeup and leaving black mascara tracks on her cheek. Daddy, I never meant for it to go this far. It started so small, just a consulting fee here and there, and then it became expected, and I was in too deep to stop. And I thought, you thought you wouldn't get caught, I finished quietly. I thought it didn't matter. Rachel screamed, her voice raw with desperation. These companies were going to get their permits anyway. The system is completely corrupt, Katie. Everyone takes money, everyone cuts corners, At least this way I could influence them to use better safety protocols, to minimize environmental damage. I was making the best of a broken system. By making it more broken, I pointed out, by taking money to approve projects that you knew would contaminate drinking water. You don't understand the complexity. I understand that children in Alamosa are going to develop leukemia if Clearwater Industries gets their permits approved, I said, my voice finally rising above conversational level. I understand that you've spent 3 years helping corporations poison poor communities, because it was financially convenient. I understand that you called me pathetic for choosing integrity over profit. Rachel flinched like I'd slapped her. Mark was studying his hands again, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this disaster. Mom and Dad looked like they were watching their family detonate in slow motion. When? Dad asked, his voice hollow. When are they? When will this happen? Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, I said. Agent Webb wanted to wait until after the holiday. Professional courtesy, Rachel repeated hysterically. You're having me arrested as a professional courtesy. I'm not having you arrested, Rachel. Your choices are having you arrested. I just made sure the evidence was documented properly. The distinction seemed lost on her. She turned to Mark with wild eyes, grasping for any lifeline that might save her from drowning.
We can fight this. We can hire lawyers. We can claim entrapment or prosecutorial misconduct, or... Rachel, Mark said quietly, I think we need to accept that this is really happening. His calm resignation hit her harder than any shouting match could have. She stared at him for a long moment, watching her last ally abandon ship, before turning back to me with something approaching hatred. I hope you're satisfied, she said, her voice shaking with rage. I hope destroying your own family was worth whatever moral superiority you think you've achieved. I didn't destroy our family, Rachel. You did that when you decided to take bribes to help corporations poison people. I just made sure you faced consequences for it. Mom finally spoke, her voice small and bewildered. Katie, sweetheart, I don't understand how you could do this. Rachel is your sister. Family protects family. We don't call the police on each other. The disappointment in her voice hurt more than Rachel's fury. This was my mother, the woman who'd taught me to tie my shoes, and helped me with algebra homework, and driven me to every piano recital and soccer game of my childhood. She was looking at me like I was a stranger who'd infiltrated her family and destroyed it from within. Mom, I said, gently, if you found out that Dad was embezzling money from his clients, would you protect him or would you make sure his victims got justice? That's completely different. It's exactly the same. Rachel used her government position to help corporations commit environmental crimes. People are going to get sick and die because of decisions she made for money. How is that different from any other kind of theft? Because she's your sister, Mom's voice cracked with emotion. Because family loyalty means something. Because we're supposed to take care of each other, not tear each other down. I looked around the table at these people who'd shaped my entire understanding of love and loyalty and responsibility. Dad, whose moral code was built on honesty and integrity, staring at his older daughter like she'd become someone he didn't recognize. Mom, whose social world was constructed on maintaining appearances and avoiding scandal, watching 30 years of careful reputation management evaporate in real time. Rachel, whose sense of identity was so tied to professional success that she'd compromised everything she claimed to believe in pursuit of career advancement. And Mark, who was already mentally calculating his exit strategy. You're right, I said finally. Family loyalty means something. It means caring enough about the people you love to stop them from destroying themselves. It means refusing to enable behavior that hurts innocent people. It means choosing integrity over comfort, even when it costs you everything. Don't lecture me about integrity, Rachel. You've been lying to us for 6 months. You've been sitting at our dinner table, smiling and nodding and pretending everything was fine while you plotted to destroy my life. I've been hoping you would make different choices, I correct. Every family gathering, every phone call, every conversation we've had since May, I've been hoping you would somehow indicate that you understood what you were doing was wrong, that you were looking for a way out of the corruption instead of going deeper into it. I never had a choice. You had choices every single day. You chose to take the first bribe. You chose to take the second one. You chose to rationalize it as business as usual instead of reporting it to your supervisors. You chose to bring Mark into it instead of finding a way to extract your. You made dozens of choices over 3 years, and every single one of them prioritized your financial benefit over public safety. Rachel was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The expectations, the quotas, the impossible deadlines. Everyone in the department was cutting corners. I was just trying to survive. By helping companies poison drinking water, by doing my job the way everyone else was doing their job. Everyone else is going to be arrested too, I said quietly. The FBI investigation covers the entire department. Rachel, you weren't just participating in corruption, you were one of the primary architects of it. The words hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over in her chair, gasping for breath between sobs. Mark reached out to comfort her, then seemed to think better of it and pulled his hand back. The gesture was small but telling. Even her boyfriend was already distancing himself from the wreckage. Dad cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet. Katie, I need to understand something. When you quit your job at Morrison & Associates, was it because you planned this? Did you deliberately sabotage your sister's career? The question hung in the air like an accusation. I could see in his eyes that he was trying to reconcile two competing versions of his younger daughter. The idealistic girl who'd always fought for underdogs, and the calculating woman who'd just destroyed her sister's life with 6 months of careful plan. I quit my job because I couldn't be part of facilitating environmental crimes, I said. Everything that happened after that was Rachel's choice. She could have stopped taking bribes. She could have reported the corruption to her supervisor. She could have found a way to extract herself from the scheme instead of deepening her involvement. But you knew she wouldn't. Dad pressed. You knew that by cooperating with the FBI, you were ensuring that Rachel would be arrested. I met his gaze directly, refusing to flinch from the disappointment I saw there. Yes, I knew that if I provided evidence of her crimes to federal investigators, she would face legal consequences for those crimes. I also knew that if I stayed silent, thousands of people would lose access to clean drinking water, while my sister and her co-conspirators got rich facilitating environmental destruction. So you chose strangers over family. I chose justice over complicity. The distinction seemed to mean nothing to him. In Dad's worldview, family loyalty trumped almost everything else. The idea that I would deliberately cause harm to Rachel, even to prevent greater harm to innocent people, violated his fundamental understanding of how families were supposed to function. Mom was staring at the shattered wine glass on the floor, watching burgundy seep into the hardwood she'd spent years maintaining. I don't know who you are anymore, she said without looking up. The Katie I raised would never do something like this. The Katie you raised learned integrity from you, I replied. Both of you taught me that honesty matters, that taking responsibility for your actions matters, that protecting people who can't protect themselves matters. I'm exactly who you raised me to be. We didn't raise you to destroy your sister. You raised me to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. That's exactly what I did. Rachel's sobs had quieted to irregular hiccups, but her face remained buried in her hand. When she finally looked up, her makeup was completely destroyed and her eyes were red and swollen. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now you hire the best criminal defense attorney you can afford, I said gently. You cooperate fully with the investigation. You take responsibility for your actions instead of trying to minimize or justify them, and you hope that demonstrating genuine remorse and cooperation might result in a reduced sentence. Reduced sentence, she repeated numbly. I'm going to prison. Probably, yeah. The words settled over the dining room like a funeral shroud. Rachel was going to federal prison. Mark was probably going to federal prison. The family that had gathered an hour ago to give thanks for their blessings was now facing the complete destruction of everything they'd built together. And it was my fault, in the most direct possible way. Except it wasn't, really. I hadn't made Rachel take bribes. I hadn't forced her to falsify environmental reports. I hadn't created the corruption scheme that had been operating for 3 years before I even knew it existed. I had simply refused to pretend I didn't know about it once I discovered the evidence. I need to go, Mark said suddenly, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. I need to call my lawyer. I'm sorry, but I can't be here right now. He was gone before anyone could respond, leaving through the front door without even grabbing his coat. Through the dining room window, I watched him fumble with his car keys in the driveway, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before managing to unlock his Tesla. Rachel watched him leave with the hollow expression of someone who'd just lost everything that mattered to her: professional reputation, romantic relationship, family support, financial security, all of it evaporating in the space of an hour-long conversation. "I hate you," she said finally, her voice flat and emotionless. "I hate you more than I've ever hated anyone in my entire life." The words should have hurt more than they did. Instead, I felt something approaching relief. For the first time in our relationship, Rachel was being completely honest about her feelings, instead of hiding behind passive-aggressive comments and strategic manipulation. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry it came to this." "No, you're not. You're not sorry at all. You planned this whole thing. You've been sitting here for months, watching me dig myself deeper, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy me completely. I've been sitting here for months, hoping you would make different choices." "Stop saying that," Rachel screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. "Stop pretending this was about giving me chances to do better. You wanted this to happen. You wanted to watch me fall." Maybe she was right. Maybe there was a part of me that had enjoyed watching her confidence and arrogance and casual cruelty finally catch up with her. Maybe I had been savoring the knowledge that her perfect life was built on corruption and lies while she lectured me about responsibility and maturity. Maybe I wasn't as noble as I wanted to believe. "You're probably right," I admit. "Maybe I did want to watch you face consequences for once in your life. Maybe I was tired of being the family disappointment, while you were the golden child, and I wanted to prove that your success was hollow." The honesty seemed to surprise her. She'd been gearing up for another round of self-righteous denial, and my admission that I might have mixed motives deflated her rage like a punctured balloon. "But that doesn't change the fact that you committed serious crimes," I continued. "And it doesn't change the fact that people are going to get sick and die if those crimes go unpunished. My motivations might not be pure, but the evidence is still real." Rachel stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Finally, she stood up from the table with the careful precision of someone who wasn't entirely sure their legs would support them. "I'm leaving," she announced. "I'm going home to figure out how to explain to my boss that I'm about to be arrested by federal agents. I'm going to call every criminal defense attorney in Denver until I find one who'll take my case. And then I'm going to spend whatever time I have left as a free person trying to figure out how my little sister turned into someone I don't even recognize." She walked toward the entryway with the same deliberate pace, pausing only to grab her purse and coat from the hall closet. At the front door, she turned back to look at the three of us still sitting around the dining table. "When this destroys our family," she said, "when Mom and Dad can't show their faces at the country club anymore, when the Thompson name becomes synonymous with federal corruption charges, remember that you chose this. You chose strangers over family. You chose revenge over love. You chose to burn everything down instead of finding a way to fix it." And then she was gone, leaving the front door open to let in the cold November air that smelled like snow and winter and end. I sat in the sudden quiet, listening to Mom's quiet crying and Dad's labored breathing, and the antique clock marking time in a house that felt like it was grieving. Outside, I could hear Rachel's car starting up and backing out of the driveway, carrying her away from the last family gathering we would probably ever have. "Are you satisfied now?" Dad asked finally, his voice carrying 32 years of disappointment and bewilderment. I thought about the question seriously. Was I satisfied? Rachel was facing federal prison. Mark was probably going to join her. Mom and Dad would spend the next several years dealing with legal bills and media attention and social ostracism. The family I'd grown up in was effectively destroyed. But children in rural Colorado weren't going to develop cancer from contaminated drinking water. Wetland ecosystems weren't going to be destroyed for mining profits. Federal environmental laws weren't going to be violated with impunity by corporations that could afford to buy regulatory approval. Justice was complicated. Family was complicated. The intersection of justice and family was more complicated than anything I'd ever navigated. I'm satisfied that I did the right thing, I said finally. I'm not satisfied that it had to cost us everything. Mom looked up from the wine stain she'd been staring at for 20 minutes. Did it have to cost us everything? The question carried so much hope and pain that it almost broke my heart. She was asking if there was any way to salvage something from the wreckage, any possibility that we could find our way back to being a family after this. I don't know, I admitted. That depends on whether you can forgive me for choosing public safety over family loyalty, and whether I can forgive myself for enjoying Rachel's downfall more than I should have. Dad pushed back from the table and stood up slowly, moving like a man who'd aged a decade in the past hour. I need some time to process this, he said. I need to understand how we got here and what happens next. He left the dining room without another word, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he climbed toward the master bedroom. A few minutes later I heard the door close with the soft finality of someone who needed to be alone with his thoughts. Mom and I sat in the ruins of Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by cold food and broken glass and the lingering scent of sage and disappointment. The turkey was still perfectly carved on its platter, the mashed potatoes still whipped to impressive peaks, the cranberry sauce still molded in festive ridges. It looked like a Norman Rockwell painting of American abundance and family togetherness, except for the federal investigation that had just destroyed everything we thought we knew about ourselves. What happens next? Mom asked, echoing Rachel's question. Next, the FBI arrests Rachel and probably several other people in the environmental department. I said. There will be media coverage and legal proceedings, and a lot of very public discussion of corruption in state government. Rachel will probably plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation with the broader investigation. And our family? I looked at my mother. This woman who'd spent 32 years trying to balance her love for two very different daughters, and realized I didn't have an answer that would comfort her. I don't know, Mom. I hope we can find a way through this, but I understand if you can't forgive me for what I've done. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the cranberry sauce that had been my contribution to the meal. Finally, she reached across the table and took my hand in hers. I don't understand your choice, she said quietly. I don't think I'll ever understand how you could do this to Rachel, but you're still my daughter, and I still love you, even if I don't know how to love you and hate what you've done at the same time. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't complete rejection either. It was acknowledgement that families could survive almost anything, even betrayal, even federal indictments, even the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about themselves. It was the beginning of whatever came next. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a snowfall, the sun reflecting off fresh powder and turning the world into something that looked deceptively peaceful. I was sitting in my apartment in Capitol Hill, nursing my second cup of coffee and trying to focus on a grant application for a water conservation project in Mesa County, when my phone buzzed with a text from Agent Webb. It's happening. Today. Thought you should know. I set the phone down carefully and stared out my window at the Denver skyline, watching early morning commuters make their way through streets that sparkled with ice crystal. Somewhere across the city, Rachel was probably getting ready for work, choosing between the navy blazer and the charcoal gray one, checking her calendar for the department meeting scheduled at 10, completely unaware that federal agents were already stationed outside her office building. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in my pajamas writing grants to protect the exact resources Rachel had spent 3 years helping corporations destroy. While she'd been building her career on corruption, I'd been rebuilding mine on the foundation of everything she'd betrayed. My phone rang at 9:47 a.m. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Katie Thompson? The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. Speaking. This is Janet Morrison from Channel 7. We understand you may have information about the arrests happening at the Colorado Department of Environmental Protection this morning. Would you be available for an interview? My blood went cold. I'm sorry, what arrest? Federal agents are currently executing arrest warrants at the state environmental office. Multiple employees are being taken into custody on corruption charges. Our sources indicate that you may have provided information that led to this investigation. I hung up without responding, my hands shaking as I set the phone on the kitchen counter. Within seconds it was ringing again. Different number, same request. Then another call and another. By 10:15, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, news producers, what sounded like every investigative journalist in Colorado. I turned off the phone and switched on the television instead. The coverage was already wall-to-wall on every local news station. Helicopters circled the state office building while reporters stood on the sidewalk describing the scene with the breathless excitement that comes with a genuinely big story. Through the aerial footage, I could see black SUVs parked outside the main entrance, and figures in FBI jackets escorting people in handcuffs toward waiting vehicles. We're getting reports that at least 6 high-ranking environmental officials have been arrested this morning, in what appears to be a massive corruption investigation, the Channel 9 anchor was saying. Sources close to the investigation describe a years-long bribery scheme, involving multiple corporations and millions of dollars in illegal payment. The camera switched to footage of a woman being escorted out of the building in handcuffs, her face turned away from the cameras but her burgundy coat clearly visible. Even from the back, even with her head down, I recognized my sister's posture, the way she held her shoulders when she was trying to maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. My phone, still turned off, sat silent on the counter while outside my apartment building. I could hear cars pulling up and doors slamming. Through my window, I watched news vans positioning themselves for the best angle on my front entrance. Somehow, despite my refusal to comment, they'd tracked down my address. I closed the blinds and moved away from the windows, settling onto my couch with the remote control and a growing sense of surreal detachment. This was really happening. The investigation that had consumed 6 months of my life was finally playing out in real time, broadcast live across every television screen in Colorado. The arrest footage played on loop while anchors speculated about the scope of the investigation and the potential penalties the defendants were facing. Rachel's name appeared on screen multiple times, identified as Senior Environmental Compliance Officer Rachel Thompson, charged with federal bribery and conspiracy. Mark's arrest had been captured outside his downtown office, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair making him look like Central Casting's idea of a corrupt lobbyist. By noon, the story had expanded beyond local news. CNN was running segments about corruption in state environmental agencies. The Washington Post had published an online article about the intersection of corporate influence and regulatory capture. Environmental groups were issuing statements praising the investigation while industry associations were distancing themselves from the arrested officials. My doorbell started ringing around. I ignored it, but the ringing persisted, sometimes accompanied by knocking, and voices calling my name through the door. I retreated to my bedroom with a sandwich and a bottle of water, leaving the television on to monitor the coverage while I hid from the media circus developing outside my building. The news cycle was relentless. Every hour brought new details about the investigation, new footage of arrests, new speculation about the environmental and financial damage caused by the corruption scheme. By evening, the story had acquired its own hashtag on social media and inspired dozens of think pieces about regulatory capture and corporate influence in government. My parents called sometime around dinner time. I'd turned my phone back on briefly to check for updates from Agent Webb, and their number appeared on the screen like an accusation. Katie. Dad's voice was exhausted, hollow in a way I'd never heard before. We need to I know this is difficult. There are reporters camped outside our house, he interrupted. They've been here since this morning asking questions about Rachel, about you, about our family. The neighbors are staring. Miss Patterson from down the street called to ask if we knew our daughter was a federal criminal. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. This was my father, the man who'd built his entire professional reputation on integrity and discretion, watching his family name become synonymous with corruption on the evening news. Dad, I'm sorry this is affecting you, and Mom, I tried to keep you out of it. You tried to keep us out of it. His voice rose with something approaching anger. Katie, our daughter was arrested on federal charges this morning. There are television cameras broadcasting our address to the entire state. How exactly did you think you were keeping us out of it? I didn't have an answer that would satisfy him. The truth was, I'd been so focused on stopping the environmental crimes that I hadn't fully considered the collateral damage to my family's reputation and privacy. I'd known Rachel would be arrested, but I hadn't anticipated the media frenzy or the impact on my parents' quiet suburban life. "Have you talked to Rachel?" I asked finally. "Her lawyer called us this afternoon. She's been released on bail pending trial, but she can't travel outside Colorado and she had to surrender her passport. She's staying at a hotel because there are reporters outside her condo building too." The image of Rachel hiding in some anonymous hotel room, watching her career and reputation dissolve on television, should have brought me some satisfaction. Instead, I felt a hollow ache that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with grief for the sister I'd lost, maybe permanently. "Katie," Mom's voice came on the line, and I realized they'd been on speakerphone the entire time. "We need to understand what happens next. The reporters are saying this could go on for months, maybe years. They're saying there might be a trial where you'll have to testify against Rachel. I don't know yet," I admitted. "Agent Webb said I might be called as a witness, but it depends on whether Rachel pleads guilty or tries to fight the charges. And if she fights them, if she pleads not guilty, then yes, I'll probably have to testify about how I discovered the evidence and what I reported to the FBI." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. In open court, with cameras rolling and reporters taking notes, I would have to detail exactly how I'd uncovered my sister's crimes and made the decision to report her to federal authority. The family conflict that had exploded over Thanksgiving dinner would become public record, dissected by legal analysts and discussed on cable news programs. "I need to ask you something," Mom said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you do this because you genuinely believed it was the right thing to do? Or did you do it because you wanted to hurt Rachel?" The question hung in the air like a judgment. It was the same question I'd been asking myself for 6 months, the same moral complexity that had kept me awake on countless nights since I'd first called Agent Webb. "Both," I said finally. "I did it because people were going to be hurt if the corruption continued. But I also did it because I was tired of watching Rachel build her success on lies, while she treated me like a failure for choosing integrity over profit. So this was revenge. This was justice. The fact that it felt like revenge doesn't make it wrong." Mom was crying quietly on the other end of the line, the kind of soft weeping that comes from watching everything you've worked to build fall apart in real time. "I don't know how to forgive this," she said. "I don't know how to forgive you for destroying our family, and I don't know how to forgive Rachel for being the kind of person who could be destroyed this way." It was the most honest thing anyone in our family had said in years. After we hung up, I sat in my darkened apartment, listening to the sounds of the news crews outside, and thinking about the price of moral clarity. I'd stopped a corruption scheme that would have poisoned drinking water for thousands of people. I'd ensured that environmental criminals faced justice for their crimes. I'd chosen public safety over family loyalty and truth over comfort. But I'd also destroyed my relationship with my sister, traumatized my parents, and turned the Thompson family name into a symbol of governmental corruption on the evening news. The victory felt as hollow as it did righteous. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Webb. "Saw the news cover. You okay?" I typed back. "Define okay. Fair enough. This gets easier, does it?" The media attention dies down. The guilt is permanent. His honesty was oddly comforting. At least someone understood that doing the right thing didn't automatically make you feel good about it. Wednesday brought more of the same: news coverage, speculation about plea deals, interviews with legal experts discussing the potential sentences Rachel and her co-conspirators were facing. The environmental groups I worked with started reaching out, some to offer support, and others to distance themselves from the controversy. Apparently, being a whistleblower made some people nervous about association, even when the whistleblowing was clearly justified. Thursday morning, everything changed. I was making coffee and trying to avoid looking at the news vans, still parked outside my building when my phone rang. Unknown number again, but this time I answered with a wary, "Hello, Ms. Thompson? This is Amanda Foster calling from Governor Hayes's. The governor would like to meet with you today, if you're available." I nearly dropped the phone. the governor wants to meet with me. Governor Hayes has been following the environmental corruption investigation closely, and she'd like to discuss it with you personally. Would 2 o'clock this afternoon work for your schedule? I looked around my pajama-clad apartment, at the dishes in the sink, and the grant applications scattered across my coffee table. I think I can make that work. Excellent. Someone from the governor's security detail will pick you up at 1:30. They'll help you avoid the media attention outside your building. After she hung up, I stood in my kitchen staring at the phone like it might suddenly make sense of what was happening. Governor Patricia Hayes wanted to meet with me. The same Governor Hayes who'd built her political career on environmental protection and government transparency. The same Governor Hayes who'd been notably silent about the corruption scandal that had dominated news coverage for the past 3 days. I spent the morning trying to figure out what to wear to meet the governor of Colorado, while avoiding the reporters who were still camped outside my building. Eventually I settled on a navy dress and the good shoes I saved for client meetings, hoping they struck the right balance between professional and not trying too hard. At exactly 1:30, someone knocked on my back door instead of the front. When I opened it, a woman in a dark suit flashed credentials and smiled. "Ms. Thompson? I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the governor's security detail. Ready to go?" She led me through the alley behind my building to an unmarked sedan, avoiding the news crews entirely. During the 20-minute drive to the state capitol, she made polite conversation about the weather and the traffic, carefully avoiding any mention of corruption investigations or federal arrests or family dynamics. The governor's office was smaller than I'd expected but more elegant, with mahogany furniture and oil paintings of Colorado landscapes and windows that offered a commanding view of the Rocky Mountains. Governor Hayes herself was younger than she appeared on television, with silver hair and intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. "Ms. Thompson," she said, standing up from behind her desk and extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." I settled into a leather chair across from her desk, trying to project confidence while internally panicking about why the governor of Colorado wanted to meet with me personally. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here," Governor Hayes said, as if reading my mind. The thought had crossed my mind. She smiled, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I was talking to someone who might actually understand the complexity of what I'd done. "Ms. Thompson, what you uncovered about the corruption in our environmental department represents one of the most significant breaches of public trust in recent Colorado history. The companies involved in this bribery scheme weren't just stealing money from taxpayers, they were purchasing the right to poison our communities. I understand that, Governor. I'm sure you do. What you might not understand is the broader context of what your investigation has accomplished." She leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more serious. "The evidence you provided to the FBI didn't just expose corruption in the environmental department, it revealed systematic problems with how we oversee corporate compliance across multiple state agencies." I waited for her to continue, not sure where this conversation was headed. "Based on your evidence, we've launched internal investigations in 3 other departments. We've identified regulatory capture problems that go far beyond environmental permits. We've discovered a pattern of corporate influence that threatens the integrity of state government itself. That's significant. It's unprecedented. And it's going to require unprecedented measures to address." Governor Hayes stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains like she was seeing them for the first time. "Miss Thompson, I'm creating a new position in state government. Director of Government Integrity and Corporate Accountability. The job involves overseeing investigations into regulatory capture, developing new policies to prevent corporate influence in government decisions, and ensuring that state agencies actually serve the public interest instead of private profit." She turned back to face me, and I suddenly understood why I was sitting in the governor's office. "I'd like to offer you that position." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "You want me to work for the state government? I want you to work for the people of Colorado, using the same moral courage and investigative skills that exposed this corruption in the first place. The position comes with a substantial salary, full benefits, and the authority to investigate any state agency that shows signs of regulatory capture or corporate influence." I thought about the irony of the offer. 6 months ago, I'd been writing consulting reports for corporations trying to navigate environmental regulations. Now I was being offered a job overseeing the integrity of those same regulatory processes. Governor, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to ask about the opt-in. Won't it look like you're rewarding me for destroying my own sister's career? It will look like I'm rewarding someone who had the courage to put public interest ahead of personal comfort, she replied firmly. The media attention around your family situation is unfortunate, but it doesn't change the fact that you potentially saved thousands of lives by exposing this corruption. And my sister? Rachel is facing federal prison because of evidence I provided. How does that affect your decision? Governor Hayes returned to her seat and looked at me with something approaching sympathy. Miss Thompson, I've been in politics for 20 years. I've seen families destroyed by corruption, by addiction, by mental illness, by every kind of crisis you can imagine. What I've learned is that sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences destroy your family. Especially then, your sister made choices that put innocent people at risk. You made choices that protected those same people. The fact that she's your sister doesn't change the moral calculus. I sat in the elegant office, surrounded by symbols of political power and public service, and tried to imagine myself in this new role, Director of Government Integrity. It sounded impossibly grand for someone who'd spent the last 6 months writing grants and hiding from reporters. What would this job actually involve? I asked. Initially overseeing the cleanup of the environmental department and implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future corruption. Long-term, developing statewide policies to ensure that regulatory agencies serve the public interest. You'd have a staff of investigators, access to financial records, and the authority to subpoena documents from any state agency. And if I discover more corruption, then you expose it, regardless of who's involved or which political party they belong to. This position reports directly to me, with independence to investigate wherever the evidence leads. The offer was everything I'd never known I wanted: meaningful work, substantial authority, the opportunity to prevent the kind of corruption that had torn apart my family. It was also a chance to rebuild my career on the foundation of the moral choices that had cost me everything else. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Of course, I hope you'll consider that this is an opportunity to turn the worst experience of your life into something that protects thousands of people from similar corruption. As Agent Chen drove me back to my apartment, I stared out the window at the city where I'd grown up, where my family had built their lives, where my sister was probably sitting in some lawyer's office learning about plea bargains and federal sentencing guidelines. Denver looked different from the backseat of a government sedan, simultaneously familiar and foreign, like a place I was seeing clearly for the first time. The reporters were still camped outside my building, but they seemed less aggressive now, more interested in the broader story of governmental corruption than in my personal drama. Agent Chen walked me to my back door and handed me a business card with a phone number. "For when you're ready to give the governor your answer," she said. Inside my apartment, I made dinner and tried to process the day's surreal developments. 6 months ago, I'd been a mid-level consultant with a stable if uninspiring career. Now I was being offered a position that would make me one of the most powerful oversight officials in state government, with the authority to investigate corruption wherever I found it. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same moral courage that had destroyed my relationship with Rachel was now opening doors I'd never imagined walking through. My phone rang while I was washing dishes. Rachel's number appeared on the screen for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner. I answered without saying hello. "Katie." Her voice was hoarse, exhausted, stripped of all the confidence and authority that had defined her for as long as I'd known her. "I saw the news vans outside your building. I wanted to make sure you were okay." The concern in her voice almost broke my heart. After everything that had happened, after the arrests and the media coverage, and the complete destruction of her carefully constructed life, she was calling to check on me. "I'm okay," I said quietly. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My lawyer says I should probably take a plea deal, cooperate with the investigation, testify against the companies involved, accept responsibility for what I did." "That sounds like good advice." "It means admitting that everything you said about me was true, that I took bribes to help corporations poison people, that I built my career on corruption and lies." I waited for her to continue, sensing that she needed to say something important. "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner," about the choices I made every day for 3 years. You were right. Nobody forced me to take that first payment. Nobody forced me to keep taking them. I convinced myself that everyone was doing it, that it didn't really matter, that I was making the best of a broken system. Rachel? No, let me finish. I convinced myself of those things, because it was easier than admitting that I was selling out everything I claimed to believe in for money. And I called you pathetic for refusing to compromise your principles. The silence that followed was heavy with 3 decades of sibling rivalry and resentment, and love that had gotten twisted into something unrecognizable. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry for calling you pathetic. I'm sorry for taking bribes that put people's lives at risk. I'm sorry for being the kind of person who could do those things and rationalize them as normal business practices. I'm sorry too, I said. I'm sorry for enjoying your downfall more than I should. I'm sorry for not finding a way to help you extract yourself from the corruption before it went this far. You tried to help. I was too arrogant to listen. We talked for another 20 minutes, carefully avoiding the big questions about forgiveness and family relationships and whether we'd ever be able to rebuild what we'd lost. But for the first time in years, we were talking honestly about who we were and what we'd done, without performance or manipulation or strategic positioning. It felt like the beginning of something, though I wasn't sure what. After we hung up, I sat on my couch with Governor Hayes's business card in my hand, thinking about the strange turns my life had taken since I'd first read those Clearwater Industries files 6 months ago. I'd lost my family, gained enemies, exposed corruption, and somehow wound up with a job offer that could define the rest of my career. Tomorrow I would call the governor and accept her offer. I would become Director of Government Integrity and Corporate Accountability, with the authority to investigate corruption wherever I found it, and the responsibility to protect Colorado's citizens from officials who put private profit ahead of public interest. But tonight, I was just Katie Thompson, sitting in my Capitol Hill apartment, grateful that my sister was finally telling the truth and terrified about what came next. 3 weeks into my new role as Director of Government Integrity and Corporate Accountability, I discovered that my sister's corruption case was more complicated than anyone had imagined. I was sitting in my new office on the 15th floor of the state capitol building, reviewing files that made my stomach turn with their casual documentation of systematic fraud, when my assistant knocked and entered with an expression that suggested trouble. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent and relates to the Environmental Department investigation. The woman who entered my office looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes were wrinkled, and her eyes had the hollow look of someone carrying information too heavy to bear alone. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like it contained her life savings. Ms. Thompson, my name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I used to work in the Environmental Department's Water Quality Division before I was transferred to the Health Department 6 months ago. She sat down across from my desk without being invited, the folder still pressed against her chest. I need to tell you something about your sister's case that nobody else knows. I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. Dr. Vasquez, if you have information relevant to a federal investigation, you should speak with the FBI, not with me. The FBI doesn't know about this because nobody reported it, the Health Department buried it, and the Environmental Department pretended it never happened. She finally placed the folder on my desk, her hands shaking slightly. Rachel wasn't just taking bribes to approve permits. She was falsifying water quality reports to hide contamination that had already occurred. The words hit me like ice water. What kind of contamination? Groundwater pollution in 3 counties that's been ongoing for 18 months. Chemical runoff from mining operations that the Environmental Department approved without proper environmental impact studies. The contamination levels exceed federal safety standards by factors of 10 to 20. Dr. Vasquez opened the folder and spread out a series of documents, water quality test results, medical reports, and correspondence between various state agencies. The papers were covered in red markings and handwritten notes that suggested someone had been tracking patterns across multiple datasets. I've been monitoring cancer rates and neurological disorders in rural communities for the past year as part of my work at the Health Department, she continued. What I found was a cluster of childhood leukemia cases in areas downstream from mining operations that your sister approved. When I tried to correlate the health data with environmental monitoring reports, I discovered that the monitoring reports had been altered. She pointed to a series of lab results that showed original readings crossed out and replaced with lower numbers. These are water samples from wells in Alamosa County. The original test showed lead levels at 40 parts per billion. The final reports submitted to federal agencies showed 4 parts per billion. Who altered the reports? Rachel's signature is on the approval forms for the revised result. But she wasn't working alone. Dr. Vasquez pulled out another set of documents, these showing email exchanges between environmental department officials and representatives from mining companies. There was a systematic effort to hide contamination data from federal oversight agencies. I stared at the papers spread across my desk, feeling sick as the implications became clear. This wasn't just corruption, it was a cover-up of environmental damage that was already harming people. Children were developing cancer because of decisions Rachel had made, and she'd been helping hide the evidence rather than addressing the contamination. Dr. Vasquez, why are you bringing this to me instead of to federal investigators? Because I tried to report it through official channels 6 months ago, and I was told that pursuing the investigation further would be detrimental to my career. Her voice carried the bitterness of someone who'd learned that doing the right thing could cost everything. I was transferred to a different department, my access to environmental data was revoked, and I was warned that discussing my findings with outside agencies would violate confidentiality agreements. Who warned you? Director Amanda Foster. The name hit me like a punch to the stomach. Amanda Foster, Rachel's boss. The same Amanda Foster who had appeared on news programs, expressing shock and disappointment about the corruption in her department. The same Amanda Foster who had publicly committed to cooperating fully with federal investigators. Director Foster knew about the contamination cover-up. Director Foster orchestrated it. She's the one who ordered the water quality reports to be altered. She's the one who decided to hide the health impacts, rather than addressing the contamination. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Miss Thompson, your sister was following orders, the bribery scheme, the falsified reports, the permit approvals. She was doing what her supervisor told her to do. I felt the world shift beneath me as I processed what she was saying. Rachel hadn't been the architect of the corruption scheme. She'd been a mid-level employee following instructions from her superior. That didn't excuse her choices, but it fundamentally changed my understanding of her culpability and the scope of the criminal enterprise. Why should I believe you? Dr. Vasquez reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. Because I have 18 hours of recorded conversations with Director Foster discussing the cover-up, including explicit instructions to destroy original water quality data and forge replacement documents. She pressed play and Amanda Foster's voice filled my office with crystal clarity. Elena, you need to understand that releasing accurate contamination data would be economic disaster for 3 counties. The mining companies provide thousands of jobs. We can't shut down operations based on preliminary health concerns that might be statistically insignificant. Director Foster, children are developing leukemia. Children develop leukemia for lots of reasons. We can't assume causation based on geographic correlation, but we can prevent economic catastrophe by being strategic about how we present environmental data. The recording continued for several more minutes, with Foster explaining how environmental reports needed to be adjusted to reflect acceptable risk levels rather than actual contamination measurement. She described the process as responsible resource management, rather than fraud, but the criminality was unmistakable. I stopped the recording and looked at Dr. Vasquez with new understanding. You've been documenting this for months. I've been trying to find someone with the authority and integrity to act on it. When Governor Hayes appointed you to this position, I hoped you might be willing to investigate corruption even when it reaches the highest levels of state government. Dr. Vasquez, what you're describing could bring down the entire leadership of the environmental department.
Director Foster isn't just Rachel's boss. She's one of the most respected environmental officials in the state. She's also a criminal who's been poisoning children to protect corporate profits. And she's been using employees like your sister to do it while positioning herself as a reform-minded public servant. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing Dr. Vasquez's evidence, cross-referencing her health data with environmental monitoring reports and financial records from the companies involved in the bribery scheme.
The pattern that emerged was staggering in its scope and systematic nature. Director Foster hadn't just known about the corruption. She'd been running it from the top. She'd recruited employees like Rachel to serve as intermediaries with corporate representatives while maintaining plausible deniability about direct bribery. She'd ordered the falsification of environmental reports to hide contamination that posed serious health risks. And she'd been positioning herself as a victim of subordinate corruption while orchestrating the entire criminal enterprise. The realization that Rachel had been a pawn rather than a mastermind didn't excuse her choices, but it fundamentally changed the moral calculus of the situation. She'd been following orders from superiors who'd convinced her that environmental protection required compromising with corporate interests. She'd been told that refusing to participate would cost her job and accomplish nothing, since someone else would simply take her place. It was the same rationalization that had allowed good people to participate in corrupt systems throughout history, the belief that individual resistance was pointless, and that working within the system was more effective than fighting it. By 6 o'clock I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. I called Agent Webb. "Marcus, it's Katie Thompson. I have new information about the environmental department case, and it's bigger than we thought." "How much bigger?" Director Foster was running the entire operation. Rachel and the others were following orders from the top, and there's evidence of ongoing contamination that's been covered up for 18 months. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Agent Webb spoke, his voice careful and controlled. "Katie, are you telling me that you've discovered evidence that could exonerate your sister?" "I'm telling you that I've discovered evidence that shows the corruption goes all the way to the department director, and that people are getting sick and dying while the cover-up continues. We need to meet tonight and bring everything you have." The meeting took place at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, far from downtown and the media attention that still surrounded the investigation. Agent Webb looked exhausted, like someone who'd been working 18-hour days for weeks while trying to unravel a criminal conspiracy that kept getting more complicated. Vasquez had agreed to join us, bringing copies of all her documentation and the recordings that implicated Director Foster in the cover-up. We spread the evidence across a corner table while Webb reviewed everything with the systematic attention of someone building a federal case. "This changes everything," he said finally. "If Foster was ordering subordinates to falsify reports and take bribes, then she's the primary target of the investigation. Your sister and the others become witnesses rather than defendants. What does that mean for Rachel's case?" "It means her lawyer should be negotiating a cooperation agreement rather than a plea deal. If she's willing to testify against Foster and provide evidence about how the scheme operated, she could avoid prison time entirely." The irony was almost overwhelming. My decision to report Rachel's corruption had ultimately led to evidence that could save her from federal prison. The investigation that had destroyed our family relationship might actually provide a path to redemption for both of us. "There's something else," Vasquez said, pulling out a final set of documents. "The contamination that's been covered up is getting worse. We're approaching a public health crisis that could affect drinking water for 50,000 people." Webb studied the health data, his expression growing more grim with each page. "How long before this becomes a medical emergency?" "It already is a medical emergency. We're just hiding it from the public and federal oversight agencies." Dr. Vasquez pointed to a map showing contamination plumes spreading through groundwater system. "If we don't start remediation efforts immediately, we're looking at cancer clusters that will persist for decades. Remediation would require shutting down the mining operations that are causing the contamination." Webb noted. "That's going to cost thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in lost revenue. Which is exactly why Director Foster has been covering it up," I said. "She's been weighing economic interests against public health and choosing economics every time." Webb gathered up the documents and recordings, organizing them into evidence bags with the careful precision of someone who'd done this many times before. "Katie, I need to ask you something. And I need an honest answer. Are you pursuing this investigation because you believe it's the right thing to do? Or because you're looking for a way to help your sister?" The question was fair and uncomfortable. I'd been asking myself the same thing since Dr. Vasquez had walked into my office that morning. Was I investigating Director Foster because she was a criminal who needed to be stopped? or because prosecuting her might save Rachel from prison? Both, I said finally. I want to help Rachel, but I also can't ignore evidence that people are being poisoned while government officials cover it up to protect corporate profits. And if helping Rachel meant burying evidence of ongoing contamination, then I wouldn't help Rachel. Public safety comes first. Webb nodded, apparently satisfied with my answer. Okay. Here's what happens next. Dr. Vasquez provides a formal statement to federal investigators and turns over all her evidence. I coordinate with the health department to begin documenting medical impacts and correlating them with contamination data. And you use your authority as Director of Government Integrity to investigate Foster's role in the cover-up. What about Rachel? Rachel's lawyer gets a call tomorrow morning about potentially changing her plea to a cooperation agreement. If she's willing to testify against Foster and provide evidence about how the bribery scheme operated, she becomes a witness for the prosecution instead of a defendant. 3 hours later, I was sitting in my car outside Rachel's hotel, staring at my phone and trying to figure out how to explain that everything we thought we knew about her case had changed. She'd been living in extended stay accommodations for 3 weeks, hiding from reporters and preparing for a federal trial that might send her to prison for 5 years. Now I was about to tell her that she might avoid prison entirely if she was willing to testify against her former boss. I called her room number from the hotel lobby. Katie? Her voice carried surprise and something that might have been hope. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you. It's about your case and it's important. Come up. Room 401. The elevator ride felt eternal. I'd been carrying the weight of destroying Rachel's life for 6 months. And now I might be offering her a path to redemption. The moral complexity was staggering. The same investigation that had exposed her corruption might ultimately save her from its consequence. Rachel answered the door in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since we were children. The hotel room was small and impersonal, with legal documents spread across the desk and clothes folded neatly in piles on the dresser. You look terrible, I said, which probably wasn't the most diplomatic opening. Prison preparation isn't great for the complexion. She gestured for me to sit in the room's single chair while she perched on the edge of the bed. What did you want to talk about? So I told her everything. About Dr. Vasquez's visit. About the evidence that Director Foster had been orchestrating the corruption scheme. About the contamination cover-up that was still ongoing. I explained how the new evidence changed her legal situation and the possibility of a cooperation agreement that could keep her out of prison. Rachel listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and something that looked like relief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands like they contained answers to questions she hadn't known how to ask. So Amanda knew, she said finally. She knew about the health impacts and she ordered us to hide them anyway. According to Dr. Vasquez's recordings, yeah, and the bribery scheme that was her idea too. It looks like it. You and the others were executing her strategy, not creating your own. Rachel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline like she was seeing it for the first time. Katie, I need you to understand something. Even if Amanda was giving orders, I still made the choice to follow them. I still took money to approve permits that I knew were environmentally questionable. I still falsified reports, I know. But following illegal orders is different from creating illegal schemes. Is it? Morally, I mean, if I knew what I was doing was wrong and I did it anyway. Does it matter whether the idea was mine or someone else? The question captured something essential about accountability and moral responsibility that I'd been wrestling with since discovering the evidence against Director Foster. Rachel had been following orders, but she'd been following orders that she knew were illegal and harmful. The fact that she'd been manipulated by her superior didn't absolve her of responsibility for her choices. I think it matters for legal purposes and sentencing guidelines, I said carefully. I'm not sure it matters for moral purpose. So you still think I'm a terrible person who sold out everything she claimed to believe in for money? I think you're a person who made terrible choices under pressure from people you trusted. And I think you're my sister. And I love you even when I hate what you've done. She turned away from the window to look at me directly. Do you really love me? I mean, after everything that's happened? Yes, I love you. And I'm proud of you for taking responsibility for your actions instead of trying to minimize or justify them. And I'm sorry that I enjoyed watching you fall more than I should have. I deserved to fall. Maybe. But you don't deserve to stay down. We talked until midnight, carefully working through 6 months of hurt and anger and betrayal that had been building since I first called the FBI. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was the beginning of understanding. Rachel had made choices that put people's lives at risk, but she'd made them while being manipulated by superiors who'd convinced her that environmental protection required compromising with corporate interests. I had exposed her crimes to protect public safety, but I'd also enjoyed the moral superiority of being right while she was wrong. Neither of us had acted with pure motives, but both of us were trying to figure out how to move forward with integrity and Katie, Rachel said as I was getting ready to leave, if I testify against Amanda, if I provide evidence about how the scheme operated, what happens to the contamination that's still ongoing? Governor Hayes will have to address it publicly and order immediate remediation efforts. The mining companies will be shut down until they can demonstrate compliance with federal water protection laws, and the communities that have been exposed to contamination will get medical monitoring and treatment. Even if it costs thousands of jobs, even public health trumps economic interests. Rachel nodded slowly, like she was finally understanding something that had eluded her for years. That's what you've been trying to tell me all along, isn't it? That some things are more important than career advancement and financial security. Yeah, I wish I'd listened to you sooner. I wish I'd found a better way to help you listen. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that would reshape Colorado's environmental regulatory system. Agent Webb arrested Director Foster at her home, executing search warrants that uncovered additional evidence of the contamination cover-up. Vasquez provided a formal statement to federal investigators, turning over 18 months of documentation that detailed the systematic falsification of environmental reports. Governor Hayes called an emergency press conference to announce the expansion of the federal investigation and the immediate suspension of mining permits in the affected county. She stood behind a podium in the Capitol building's press room, flanked by federal agents and health department officials, and delivered the kind of statement that ends political careers and transforms environmental policy. The people of Colorado deserve government officials who put public health ahead of corporate profits, she declared, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd built her career on exactly that principle. The contamination cover-up we've discovered represents a fundamental betrayal of public trust that will not be tolerated. She announced the creation of an independent oversight board to monitor environmental compliance, headed by someone with unimpeachable integrity and a proven track record of exposing corruption even when it was personally costly. She announced that I would be chairing that board. The media attention that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced during the initial investigation. This wasn't just about individual corruption. It was about systematic problems with how government agencies balanced economic and environmental interests. Editorial boards across the state praised Governor Hayes for her decisive action, while environmental groups hailed the investigation as a watershed moment for regulatory oversight. But the most important moment came 3 days later when Rachel's lawyer called to confirm that she'd accepted a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. She would testify against Director Foster and provide evidence about the corruption scheme in exchange for probation and community service instead of prison time. That evening, we met for dinner at a quiet restaurant in downtown Denver, the first meal we'd shared since the Thanksgiving disaster that had started everything. Rachel looked better than she had in weeks, like someone who'd finally stopped carrying a weight she couldn't bear alone. "So you're going to be the most powerful environmental oversight official in the state," she said after we'd ordered. "That's quite a career change from grant writing. It's quite a change from environmental compliance officer to federal witness too." "Fair point," she smiled, and for the first time in months, it looked genuine. "Katie, I want you to know that I understand why you reported me to the FBI. I hated you for it, and I probably always will on some level. But I understand, and I want you to know that I'm sorry for the way I enjoyed watching your world fall apart. That wasn't justice, that was revenge, and it was unworthy of the principles I claimed to be defending. Maybe we're both more complicated than we thought we were. Maybe families are more complicated than we thought they were. We spent 2 hours talking about everything except corruption and federal investigations and environmental contamination. We talked about childhood memories and shared friends and the possibility of Rachel finding meaningful work once her legal obligations were complete. We talked about whether our parents would ever forgive us for turning Thanksgiving dinner into the opening act of a federal investigation. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before everything went wrong, but it was the beginning of something more honest than what we'd lost. We were sisters who'd hurt each other badly while trying to do what we thought was right, and we were learning that love could survive even that. As we were leaving the restaurant, Rachel stopped on the sidewalk and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Katie, there's something I need to tell you about Director Foster, something that might change how you think about this whole situation." "What do you mean?" "Amanda didn't just order us to take bribes and falsify reports. She had us specifically targeting companies that were donating to environmental groups that opposed the governor's mining policies." I felt the world shift beneath me again. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the corruption scheme wasn't just about money, it was about political control. Amanda was using our department to punish companies that supported environmental protection while rewarding companies that opposed it. And Governor Hayes, I don't know what Governor Hayes knew or when she knew it, but Amanda always said she was implementing the governor's vision for balanced environmental policy." Rachel walked away into the Denver evening, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with the terrible possibility that the governor who'd appointed me to expose corruption might herself be implicated in the schemes I was investigating. The moral complexity of the situation had just become infinitely more complicated, and I was beginning to understand that the line between justice and complicity was far blurrier than I'd ever imagined. The possibility that Governor Hayes might be connected to the corruption scheme haunted me through a sleepless night. I sat in my apartment until dawn, reviewing every conversation I'd had with the governor, every decision she'd made since appointing me, every public statement she'd issued about environmental protection. Was I investigating corruption at her direction, or was I being manipulated by someone who needed a credible front for her own criminal enterprise? By morning, I'd made a decision that terrified me. I was going to investigate the governor who'd given me the power to investigate corruption. If she was clean, I'd confirm her integrity and continue the work she'd entrusted to me. If she was complicit, I'd expose her even if it meant destroying my career and facing political retaliation that could follow me for the rest of my life. The first step was accessing financial records and communication logs that would show any connections between the governor's office and the companies involved in the bribery scheme. As Director of Government Integrity, I had broad investigative authority, but using it to examine the governor's activities would require extraordinary discretion. I started with public records, campaign contributions, lobbying disclosures, and official correspondence between the governor's office and environmental agency. What I found was a pattern of communications that suggested close coordination between Governor Hayes and Director Foster, including regular meetings that weren't reflected in official calendars and email exchanges that used personal accounts rather than government systems. The deeper I dug, the more complicated the picture became. Governor Hayes had built her political career on environmental protection, championing policies that restricted mining operations and strengthened water quality regulation. But those same policies had created economic pressure on rural communities that depended on resource extraction for employment. The mining companies that had been bribing state officials weren't just seeking permits to contaminate groundwater. They were seeking relief from environmental regulations that threatened their economic viability. If those companies could prove that compliance was impossible due to regulatory overreach, they could pressure the governor to moderate her environmental policies or face responsibility for massive job losses. It was a sophisticated political strategy disguised as simple corruption: create a crisis by violating environmental laws, then use that crisis to justify weakening the laws themselves. And if state officials were taking bribes to facilitate the violations, those officials became expendable scapegoats when the scheme was exposed. The more I understood the political dynamics, the more I realized that my investigation might have been playing directly into Governor Hayes' long-term strategy. By exposing corruption in the environmental department, I'd provided her with justification for reforming the regulatory system in ways that might actually benefit the same companies that had been paying bribes. 3 days into my investigation of the governor's potential involvement, I received a call that changed everything. "Katie Thompson?" This is Detective Maria Santos with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I need to meet with you about the environmental corruption case. There's something you need to know about Governor Hayes. We met at a park in Aurora, far from downtown, and the political intrigue that had consumed my life for the past month. Detective Santos was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that suggested she'd spent years building cases against people who thought they were untouchable. Thompson, what I'm about to tell you is part of an ongoing investigation that's been operating parallel to the FBI corruption probe, she began. Governor Hayes hasn't just been aware of the bribery scheme in the environmental department, she's been running it. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. Governor Hayes built her career on environmental protection. She's the one who appointed me to investigate corruption. She's also the one who's been using that corruption to justify policy changes that benefit the same companies paying the bribes. Detective Santos pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of financial records. Governor Hayes has been receiving payments through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, the same shell company that was funneling money to Rachel and the other environmental official. I stared at the financial documents, watching my understanding of the entire situation collapse and rebuild itself around a reality I'd never imagined. How long have you known? We've been investigating Governor Hayes for 18 months, ever since we noticed discrepancies between her public environmental policies and her private financial arrangements. The corruption in the environmental department was just one piece of a much larger scheme. Why didn't you tell me this when I started investigating Director Foster? Because we needed someone with credible integrity to expose the lower-level corruption before we moved against the governor. Your investigation provided the evidence we needed to prove that Hayes was orchestrating the scheme from the top. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Governor Hayes had used my moral outrage about environmental corruption to build a case against her own subordinates, positioning herself as a reform-minded leader while secretly orchestrating the crimes I was exposing. She'd appointed me to investigate corruption that she'd created, knowing that my integrity would lend credibility to whatever reform she proposed. Detective Santos, what's the scope of this investigation? How many people know about Governor Hayes' involvement? Currently, you're one of 12 people who have access to this information. The investigation is being conducted by a joint task force that includes the FBI, the CBI, and the Federal Environmental Crimes Unit. We're preparing arrest warrants for Governor Hayes and approximately 15 other officials across multiple state agencies. When? Next week. We wanted to give you advance notice because you're going to be called as a witness in the federal case against Hayes. Your investigation into Director Foster uncovered evidence that's crucial to proving the governor's involvement. I spent the rest of the afternoon processing the implications of what Detective Santos had told me. Governor Hayes wasn't just another corrupt politician. She was a criminal mastermind who'd built an entire career on environmental protection while secretly facilitating environmental destruction for profit. She'd used my family's tragedy and my commitment to justice as tools in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of state government. The irony was almost unbearable. I'd destroyed my relationship with Rachel to expose corruption that the governor was secretly orchestrating. I'd accepted a position investigating government integrity from someone who embodied the complete absence of integrity. I'd been working to protect environmental laws that she was systematically undermining. But there was also a strange vindication in the discovery. My decision to report Rachel's corruption had ultimately led to exposing the governor's far more serious crimes. The investigation that had torn apart my family was now unraveling a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Colorado government. That evening, I called Rachel to tell her about the new developments. She listened without interrupting as I explained how Governor Hayes had been orchestrating the entire corruption scheme while positioning herself as a reform-minded environmental champion. So Amanda was following orders from the governor? Rachel asked finally. It looks that way. And you were following orders from Amanda, who was following orders from Hayes. The whole thing was a top-down criminal enterprise designed to create justification for weakening environmental regulation. Katie, do you realize what this means? Governor Hayes used your investigation to expose her own subordinates while protecting herself. She appointed you to investigate corruption that she created. The manipulation was so sophisticated that it almost deserved admiration. Hayes had identified me as someone with unimpeachable integrity and moral courage, then used those qualities to build a case against her co-conspirators, while positioning herself as the solution to the corruption problem she'd created. "There's something else," I told Rachel. "Detective Santos says the investigation into Hayes has been ongoing for 18 months. They knew about her involvement before I ever reported the corruption to Agent Webb. So when you called the FBI about my activities, they already knew that the corruption went all the way to the governor's office. They knew Hayes was involved, but they needed credible evidence from someone with integrity to build a prosecutable case. My investigation provided that evidence." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Rachel had been prosecuted for crimes that were ultimately ordered by the governor, while the governor had used that prosecution to enhance her own reputation as a corruption fighter. The injustice was staggering, but it was also evidence of a conspiracy that was far more serious than individual bribery. "Rachel, there's something I need to ask you. When you agreed to the cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, did anyone mention that your testimony might be used against Governor Hayes?" "No. They said I'd be testifying against Amanda and possibly some corporate executives. Nobody mentioned the governor. That's because they couldn't reveal the broader investigation without compromising it. But your testimony about taking orders from Director Foster is going to be crucial evidence that Foster was taking orders from Hayes. So I'm not just testifying against my former boss, I'm testifying against the governor of Colorado." "Yes, and so am I." The federal task force moved with precision and coordination that suggested months of careful planning. On Tuesday morning, Governor Hayes was arrested at her home on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, bribery, and violation of federal environmental laws. The arrest was coordinated with simultaneous raids on her office, her campaign headquarters, and the homes of 14 other officials involved in the conspiracy. The media coverage was unlike anything in Colorado political history. Governor Hayes, who'd built her career on environmental protection and government transparency, was revealed as the mastermind of a corruption scheme that had facilitated environmental crimes across multiple counties, while enriching her personal bank accounts through shell companies and offshore investment. The evidence that emerged during the first week of coverage painted a picture of breathtaking criminality and political manipulation. Hayes had been taking payments from mining companies for 3 years, while publicly advocating for stronger environmental regulation. She'd been ordering subordinates to falsify contamination reports, while appearing at press conferences to discuss water quality protection. She'd been orchestrating bribery schemes, while positioning herself as a champion of government integrity. But the most damning evidence came from recorded conversations between Hayes and Director Foster, where the governor explicitly ordered the Environmental Department to approve permits for companies that had made substantial payments to her shell company, while rejecting permits for companies that supported environmental groups opposed to her policy. In one recording, Hayes could be heard saying, "Amanda, I need you to understand that environmental protection is a political strategy, not a moral imperative. We use environmental concerns to control corporate behavior, and we reward companies that cooperate with our political objectives." The recording destroyed any possibility that Hayes could claim ignorance of the corruption scheme, or argue that she'd been betrayed by subordinates acting without her knowledge. 3 weeks after the arrests, I found myself sitting in a federal courthouse in Denver preparing to testify in the case against Patricia Hayes, former governor of Colorado. The courtroom was packed with reporters, political observers, and environmental activists who'd followed the case since it began with Rachel's arrest 6 months earlier. Rachel had testified the day before, providing detailed evidence about how the corruption scheme had operated at the departmental level, and how Director Foster had presented the bribery system as official policy ordered by the governor's office. Her testimony had been devastating for Hayes, who sat at the defendant's table looking like a woman watching her entire life's work revealed as an elaborate fraud. When my turn came to testify, the federal prosecutor walked me through the timeline of my investigation, from discovering the Clearwater Industries files at Morrison & Associates, through my decision to report Rachel's corruption to the FBI. I explained how my investigation into Director Foster had uncovered evidence of the governor's involvement, and how that evidence had been corroborated by financial records and recorded conversation. Thompson, the prosecutor asked, at any point during your investigation, did you suspect that Governor Hayes might be involved in the corruption scheme? Not until very recent. Governor Hayes's public record on environmental protection was so strong that it never occurred to me that she might be orchestrating the crimes I was investigating. And when you accepted the position of Director of Government Integrity, did you understand that you might be investigating the person who appointed you? No. I thought I was investigating corruption despite potential political pressure from the governor's office. I never imagined I was investigating corruption because of criminal orders from the governor's office. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on my motivations for reporting Rachel's corruption, and whether my family relationship had influenced my investigative decision. She tried to argue that I was an unreliable witness, whose judgment had been compromised by personal animosity toward my sister. Ms. Thompson, isn't it true that you reported your sister to federal authorities because you resented her professional success? It's true that I resented the way Rachel built her success on corruption while lecturing me about responsibility and integrity, but I reported her crimes because people were being harmed by the environmental violations she was facilitating, not because of family dynamics. And when you discovered evidence that might exonerate your sister, didn't you pursue that evidence because you wanted to help her avoid prison? I pursued evidence of Director Foster's involvement because Dr. Vasquez brought me documentation of ongoing contamination that was being covered up. The fact that this evidence changed Rachel's legal situation was secondary to the public health implications, but you admit that personal considerations influenced your investigative decision. I admit that I'm human, and that investigating corruption within my own family created emotional complexity that I had to navigate while still doing my job. The prosecutor's redirect focused on the evidence itself rather than my motivations for pursuing it. The financial records, the recorded conversations, and the health data all supported the same conclusion. Governor Hayes had been running a criminal enterprise that prioritized corporate profits over public safety, while using environmental protection as political cover. After 4 days of testimony from various witnesses, the case went to the jury. The evidence was so overwhelming that deliberations took less than 6 hours. Governor Patricia Hayes was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed on a sitting governor in Colorado history. Director Foster received 8 years. The corporate executives who'd paid bribes received sentences ranging from 3 to 6 years. Rachel, whose cooperation had been crucial to the prosecution, received 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service with Environmental Restoration Organization. 6 months after the trial ended, I was sitting in my office in the state capitol building reviewing proposals for new environmental oversight procedures that would prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had operated under Governor Hayes. The interim governor had asked me to stay on as Director of Government Integrity, expanding my authority to investigate corruption across all state agencies, rather than just environmental departments. The work was challenging and meaningful, exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd first decided to report corporate environmental crimes to the FBI. But it was also complicated by the knowledge that my investigation had started with destroying my sister's career, and ended with destroying the career of the woman who'd appointed me to investigate corruption. The moral complexities of the situation had never fully resolved themselves. I'd done the right thing by exposing corruption that threatened public health, but I'd also been manipulated by a criminal who'd used my integrity as a tool in her own conspiracy. I'd saved my sister from prison, but only after putting her there in the first place. Rachel and I had dinner together once a month now, usually at quiet restaurants where we could talk without being recognized by people who'd followed our story in the media. Our relationship was different than it had been before everything went wrong, more honest but also more fragile, built on the shared understanding that we'd both made choices that had hurt people we loved. Do you ever regret reporting me to the FBI? She asked during one of these dinners, several months after the trials had ended. Do you ever regret taking bribes to help companies poison rural communities? I replied, every day. Then no, I don't regret reporting, but I regret that it was necessary. and I regret that I enjoyed watching you suffer more than I should have. I regret that too. The suffering part, I mean, not the reporting part. We were learning to live with the complexity of loving each other while acknowledging the harm we'd caused. It wasn't the simple forgiveness that family stories usually end with, but it was more honest than the relationship we'd had before, when love had been conditional on maintaining comfortable illusions about who we were and what we were capable of. My parents had eventually forgiven both of us, though it had taken months of difficult conversations and family therapy sessions that felt like diplomatic negotiations between hostile nations. Dad had struggled with the idea that his daughter had committed federal crimes, while Mom had struggled with the idea that his other daughter had exposed those crimes to federal authority. But they'd also been proud, in their complicated way, that we'd both ultimately chosen to tell the truth and accept responsibility for our actions, rather than hiding behind rationalizations and excuses. The environmental contamination that had been covered up for 18 months was being addressed through a massive remediation effort funded by the companies that had caused it. The children who developed cancer in areas downstream from mining operations were receiving medical treatment and long-term monitoring. The communities that had been exposed to contaminated drinking water were getting clean water systems and ongoing health service. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was justice of a kind: accountability for the people who'd caused harm, remediation for the communities that had been harmed, and systemic changes to prevent similar harm in the future. And somewhere in rural Colorado, children were drinking clean water from wells that weren't contaminated by mining chemicals, because a family argument at Thanksgiving dinner had ultimately led to exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of state government. The story that had started with my sister calling me pathetic had ended with both of us learning what integrity actually cost, and what it was actually worth. We'd discovered that doing the right thing didn't always feel good, that family loyalty and moral courage sometimes conflicted with each other, and that justice was more complicated than either punishment or forgiveness. But we'd also discovered that truth had its own power, that courage could be contagious, and that sometimes the hardest thing you ever do becomes the thing you're most proud of. Rachel finished her community service the following spring, working with environmental restoration organizations to repair some of the habitat damage that had been caused by the companies she'd helped while working for the state. It was appropriate penance, using her knowledge of environmental systems to heal the damage she'd helped create. I kept my job as Director of Government Integrity, expanding the program to investigate corruption in education, transportation, and social services department. The work was never easy, but it was always meaningful. Every investigation I completed, every corruption scheme I exposed, every public official I held accountable, was another step toward the kind of government that served citizens rather than private interest. And every month, Rachel and I had dinner together, two sisters who'd hurt each other badly while trying to do what they thought was right, learning to love each other despite their failures, and because of their shared commitment to being better than they'd been. It wasn't the ending either of us would have chosen, but it was the ending we'd earned through the choices we'd made, and the prices we'd been willing to pay for integrity. Sometimes the hardest walls we break through are the ones built by the people who were supposed to love us most. But when you stop knocking on closed doors and build your own, you don't just find freedom, you find yourself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.